Well, folks, one more for today, and then I need to hit the bricks. Got a few chores to take care of this afternoon, and then we're going out to dinner tonight, date night. Often I'll be in the office here, my office, and I'll see something that stimulates some memories, and I think, man, that'd make an interesting story for my YouTube channel here. So the other day I was rummaging through the desk, and I came across this switch. It's just a simple toggle switch, um, on, off. Just a simple one. It no longer works. After it came out of a T-38 crash, and it's been handled and mishandled and so forth. But we traced the cause of the accident down to a failure of this switch, which was fascinating. The airplane was on a local mission, flown up at a Strategic Air Command, a SAC base, by two co-pilots. One was a bomber co-pilot, and the other one was a KC-135 tanker co-pilot. The tanker guy was in the front cockpit, and the bomber guy was only cockpit left in the rear. So anyway, they were on a local ride just to take off and fly some instrument approaches. We did that quite a bit, really. You could get about 5 or 6 instrument approaches on an hour 5, hour 10 flight, depending on traffic. So these guys had briefed, and the weather was clear skies, but there were ice crystals forecast. Now, in the T-38, we could not fly in known icing conditions, but ice crystals, there was not any mention one way or the other. So they went out and took off and flew a couple approaches, and then on this incident approach, they were coming around and they began to configure. And one of the things that we do is we always check the airspeeds below 240 knots. That was the limiting gear speed. So these guys saw where the airspeed was below 240, and they put the gear down. Well, when the gear came down, the airplane just rock and rolled. It just started shuddering and this, that, and the other. And then they got a master caution light and the annunciator panel telling them what was wrong with the airplane. Just lit up like a Christmas tree. Holy crap. So they went to A, not knowing what the problem was. They went to AB. They checked their gear, and they had 2 green, and the right main was out. The light was out. So they went around trying to figure this out. They tried to put the gear up, but it wouldn't retract. So they declared an emergency and flew around a bit, trying to figure it out. It's quite disorienting. And once they got everything kind of stabilized, they were still far enough out where they thought they could fly by the tower, have them look at the gear, and tell them what they were looking at, what they were seeing. So they went by the tower, and the tower said, "Hey, it looks like you've got all 3 gear down, but the right main gear down. Right main gear is hyperextended. It's extended further than what the limit should be." Okay, fine. That's not good. So they went back around, came back around, and when they came in, they thought, well, let's try to land to see if we can set this thing down. Really, in retrospect, that was not a good idea because with that gear being hyperextended, it would not have held the airplane anyway, and they probably would have ended up cartwheeling. So anyway, they came around, and the guy in the front seat said, "Boy, I don't feel comfortable with flying this." He said, "Would you mind flying it?" And the guy in the back seat, the bomber pilot, said, "Yeah, I'll do it. Don't worry about it." So anyway, he came back around. On these rides, when you had 2 co-pilots, the guy in the back seat was not authorized to make a landing. But what else are you going to do? So he came around, and I don't know, I can't remember now if they actually touched down, but it became apparent that wasn't going to work. So they just executed a go around and flew out to the designated bailout area, and then they jumped out. And that's when I got in the act. I was the investigating officer on this airplane, on this accident. So we go rolling up. This was up at Ellsworth Air Force Base in 1979, I think. So we go collecting up there, and both guys got out of the airplane okay. And boy, this was in January, so it was really snowy and miserably cold. Anyway, they managed to go out. We found the airplane. It wasn't hard to find. And we went out and looked at it. Well, there wasn't too much we could do to looking at it out there. So they picked the airplane up, bits and pieces, and set it on a flatbed truck and then brought it back to the base. It was amazing. So we got it back to the base, and they put it out on a hangar floor. And so we're standing there just looking at all the pieces and so forth. One of the things they teach you in aircraft accident investigation school is the two things you look for first in an aircraft accident investigation. You look for pieces that are there that shouldn't be there, and you look for pieces that aren't there that should be there. Well, couldn't find the right main gear door. That's kind of strange. So, okay, so as we sifted through the wreckage, we still couldn't find it. So we got a radar plot and found out where they first configured the airplane. And so we got a mark about that. So we got a helicopter and flew out to that area. Now, my boss at the time was Jerry Hodson down in San Antonio. And he said, there's no way in hell you're going to find that white gear door in the snow this time of year. And I said, what are you thinking, Jerry? A case of beer? And he said, you're on. Well, that was already in the refrigerator as far as I was concerned. So we flew out there, and as we're flying around, I couldn't spot the gear door per se, but I saw the shadow of it. So we landed on a road and hiked over, picked it up. And I said, looks like a case of Bud Light to me. Anyway, we took it back, and it turns out that gear door did help us with solving the riddle, if you will. What had happened is during the flight, this switch had failed. It failed. And what had happened is, you can't see it, but I've taken it apart here. Inside the switch, there's those contacts. The one set of contacts is for on, the other's off. That's on, off. Not a big problem. And when you look at this, inside there's just a very small, actually it's about 50-60% built up in essence, carbon deposit. And that was built up. Apparently it had a weak spring in there that allowed that contact to back off. So every time you turn it on, yeah, it made contact, but the spring was not that strong to hold it, and it started arcing. Over a period of time, that arcing allowed a carbon deposit to build up until it eventually failed. The mean time between failures of this switch, if memory serves, is something like 50,000 hours. Well, they can't get 50,000 hours out of that airplane. So the switch failed. Now, we're flying in ice crystals. So as the pitot tube cooled, it started to allow an ice ball to form up inside the pitot tube that gives us our airspeed indication. And as that ice ball began to speed up or form, less air was coming in the pitot tube, so the airspeed started dropping off. So these guys just inadvertently kept pushing the throttles up, not realizing it was a very slow process. Well, we went back and checked the tapes, and when they had put the gear down, they were doing about 280 knots. Now you think 40 knots above the gear speed at 240 for the gear speed, and they're only at 280. You think, well, 40 knots, that's not a big deal. Yes, it is, because you deal with that mass times velocity squared. So the force on that gear door was a force of 280 squared versus 240 squared, which is a significant amount of force. And furthermore, in that right main gear, or what we found, or in the right main gear, was indication of corrosion. So now you have an overspeed, you have corrosion in it. So when a gear door came down, or when the gear came down, that gear door acted like an airfoil, like a wing, and it flew it outbound. And when it got it going, it just ripped it and ripped the hydraulics out. And so they lost half their hydraulics. They lost the ability to retract the gear. And so there's no way they could really land it. So they came in, they jumped out and so forth. And the way we found this was they had all these pieces laid out in the airplane. Everyone was focused on the gear door and the corrosion in the gear. And then I got the job of tracing the wiring from the switch back through the aircraft system. You wanted to trace that all the way to see if there was a break in that wire at some place or another. Otherwise, that pretty well narrowed it down to the switch. So I got to sit there with my pocket knife and shred that wire out of the wiring bundle. Probably took me a day and a half to do that, but it was interesting to see how those wires all came together. Now, in an typical accident investigation, we would meet in the evenings about 5 o'clock, and everybody gather around and go over what we found during the day, and then we would take what we learned and then map out the next day's plan. So this one evening, we're sitting around and pretty well got this thing figured out, and came to the flight surgeon, and the flight surgeon said he was pretty well complete with his investigation, with one exception. He says the co-pilot, the bomber pilot, has a cut on his earlobe, and he says he couldn't figure out how he got that. There was blood in the helmet, and then there was also blood in the on his ear. He says, and on his flight suit, he just couldn't figure out how he got that during the ejection or whatever. And he says, I still have that to resolve. And he said, I'm not sure how I'm going to go about doing that. And of course, ever the smart ass, I said, have you thought about asking him? And the flight surgeon kind of did a double take. Why didn't I think of that? So anyway, we left it at that. The next night, the flight surgeon came in laughing. He says, okay, he says, I got a report to give you. He says, I called the guy in and said, okay, we've got about this all about wrapped up. He said, I got one question left. He said, how in the world did you injure your ear? Do you have any idea? And the guy looked at him rather sheepishly. And then he told him, he spilled the beans. He says, well, he says, last weekend, he says, I signed up for a buffalo hunt. And he said, we went out, we were hunting buffalo. And he says, got one. And he said, one of the traditions of your first kill is to wear they give you an earring for your ear. And they take a buffalo knife and jam it in your earlobe, and that's how they get the earring in. Okay, then. That solved that part of the problem. I don't know if that made the report or not. I can't remember that. But anyway, the whole point of this discussion goes to give you some insight into how we conducted the investigation, what happened. When you think about it, 50,000 hours, that's not too bad on this one switch. But in this case, it was rather catastrophic. We lost an airplane. Thank goodness we didn't lose the two pilots. Gives you an idea how thorough this thing can be. We'd actually taken a switch and we sent it to Wright-Patterson to the labs over there, and they're the ones that discovered the carbon buildup. So just fascinating. And I served on maybe 5 accident boards during my tenure in safety, and really enjoyed them. So that's the story of this little switch. I don't know what I'm going to find in my desk drawer next week, but I'll find something to talk about. Hope everybody has a great evening. Talk to you soon.